It's a great honor to be here. Thank you, Emma, for inviting me. It's good to be back here in the University of Toronto. As Lois mentioned, I used to be here from 94 to 96. I was a postdoc in the physics department. And that was the last time that I was a card-carrying physicist. Since then, I've never been employed by a physics department. It's not the fault of the University of Toronto, it's the choices that I made that led me to be not employed by a physics department. But in any case, so that was the thing. And that actually puts me in a kind of especially difficult moment. It's, apart from the honor of trying to follow somebody like Professor Polanyi, it's also a very scary experience to talk about science and scientists and responsibility while not just a card-carrying physicist, but also following a Nobel laureate, right? So it's a hard task that Emma has given me, and I'll try to do what I can. I want to start by actually explaining the sort of source of my title, the double movement. And this goes back again, like the nuclear age, to 70 years, and to a book that Professor Polanyi's uncle, Karl Polanyi, wrote, called The Great Transformation. It's a remarkable book about the sort of growth of a market economy. And what Karl Polanyi sort of talked about was that the history of the last couple of centuries at that point had been marked by something that he called a double movement. That on the one hand, you had the expansion of the market. By market, he meant what today one might call neoliberalism, if you like, into sort of essentially every part of the globe. But that expansion had been met everywhere with a kind of counter movement that tried to check the expansion. And the other profound insight that Karl Polanyi had was that while people talk about a free market and so on, and describe it in ways as though it is sort of spontaneous, it's actually that part of the activity which is highly planned. And the counter movement is actually very spontaneous, people resisting in ways that are not necessarily planned. In any case, what I'm going to try to do and try to argue here is to draw a crude parallel with certain aspects of science and technology and some of the insights that Polanyi had. And so I hope you will sort of indulge me by letting me do that. And I was going to talk about what Lois mentioned, very crudely speaking, the two major threats that confront humanity, nuclear war and climate change. And I want to sort of bring this up because in many ways, there are profound parallels between the nuclear weapons conundrum and the climate. And there are also profound differences. I sit on the board of the Science and Security board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And every year we sort of sit together to try and decide what the doomsday clock, the clock which is invented in 1947, to try and say where we are with respect to doomsday, should be set at every year based on what the current status of the world is. And some years ago, this was before I was on the board, the Bulletin decided that nuclear weapons alone is not the only threat that we should be thinking about. Increasingly, climate change has begun to be seen as an equally important threat. And indeed, it's something which is much more resonant with members of the public. Right? As I was telling Lois, nuclear weapons are not something which really engage the members of the public for the most part today, right? It was not the case always, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. In any case, one of the things that we discuss every year when we are trying to set this clock is, in the case of nuclear weapons, we can see, well, there's a new arms control agreement, so maybe we can think about setting it back. On the other hand, there is some new test by North Korea or something, you can think about setting the clock forward. How does one think about climate? Because climate, we sort of inexorably seem to be moving towards it. And this is the conundrum that we see ourselves in, so there are some profound differences. At the same time, I'd also like to argue that there are profound parallels in that it's the same mindset that bought us nuclear weapons that seems to be preventing us from getting out of this climate treadmill, right? I don't have time to talk about that, but if there are any Q&A questions, I'm happy to sort of talk about it then. In any case, in this sort of situation, what kinds of roles sort of have scientists played? That's what I wanted to really talk about. And so the first role that I would mention is quite often what they're doing is actually creating or further accentuating the problem, right? Scientists were the ones who designed the first nuclear weapons. And those scientists were held up as great heroes. The Manhattan Project is still seen in the physics community as that marvelous period when some of the brightest minds came together and solved a really difficult problem. And it was still seen as something which was to be worthy of emulation in some fundamental level. They also often find newer ways of polluting the atmosphere, research novel ways of extracting resources, the latest being fracking and for natural gas, which you know very well that in the context of climate change, it's not such a great idea to be producing more and more fossil fuels, and coupled with the sort of escape of methane at fracking and so on and so forth. But this is something which scientists sort of do, scientists, technicians, engineers, and for good reasons. There is certainly more money in this, there's more power, there's more prestige, there's official recognition. And also going back to what Professor Polanyi said, if you think about to do science, you might be in it for the love of truth, but you have to be getting your research grants from somewhere. And quite often, this is where much of the money sort of comes in, right? So this has been one role that they have played. And it's not as though they are necessarily doing this in order to do this destructive activity, right? There are two aspects to this which I think are important. The first is there's a way by which scientists justify what they are doing as being part of the exploration of curiosity, of trying to answer curiosity, right? So if there is gas down there, how do we get it out? And there is something very innovative that they have done in trying to blast the rock and get the rock and get the gas to come out, right? It requires, profound breakthroughs in technology and in scientific modeling, and so on. And you can see similar kinds of arguments, certainly in the case of the atomic bomb. It was something which just a decade ago could have never been conceived of. And so you see Oppenheimer, the head of the Manhattan Project, talk about it at his farewell speech from Los Alamos when he left to go to go to California before he came to Princeton. And he said, when you come right down to it, the reason that we did this job is because it was an organic necessity. If you're a scientist, you cannot stop such a thing. If you're a scientist, you believe that it is good to find out how the world works, that it is good to find out what realities are, and that it is good to turn over to mankind at large the greatest possible power to control the world and to deal with it according to its lights and its values. So the argument here essentially is that within science, we are not going to try to make decisions about how the power that we unleash is to be used. It is somebody else's problem, right? And as the singer, whose name I forget right now, but wrote about the song, what happens when you try to do something spontaneous and you forget stuff. But the guy who invented the ballistic missile, and he says, my job is to sort of launch the missile. Where it comes down is somebody else's department. Sorry? That's right, Tom Lehrer. Thank you very much. So there is certainly one sense in which you can say this is not part of our responsibility, right? It is somebody else's decision. There's another way in which I think scientists sort of who are involved in these kind of activities justify it, and that is through some kind of an ideology. If you sort of like physicists perform a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment, and you were to go and interview a bunch of people who work in Los Alamos, the place where US nuclear weapons are made, and say, why are you doing this kind of activity? Odds are that you're not going to hear anybody say, oh, we just want to nuke those Russians or the Iranians or whoever it is. You'd probably hear them say, well, we do this to keep the peace, for deterrence, right? some kind of a lofty purpose of that sort, right? They see nuclear weapons as not necessarily an evil thing, as something which is actually contributing to the betterment of the world. Now, this is not something which I made up. There are people who have gone and done anthropological research in these places, and these are the kinds of answers that they get. And why is it that they would do that? Because in order for you to be able to go and work day in and day out doing this kind of activity, you have to justify it to yourself. You have to look at yourself in the mirror in the morning. And it's not something which you can do by just saying, I'm going to go and kill a lot of people. That's not something which necessarily motivates people. So you have to sort of justify it in various ways. And so this, I think, is one very central thing which we cannot sort of escape. And in the process of doing that, it's not always that they are doing scientific discoveries, not always they're doing technical things. A lot of it has to do with how they justify and how they raise resources to carry on whatever they're doing by appealing on a variety of other grounds. So as an example from India, India just happens to be the country that has studied best both the nuclear energy and the nuclear weapons histories. The founder of the Indian nuclear program was a physicist called Homi Bhabha. And Bhabha, apart from having started the atomic energy program, which started designing nuclear weapons at a fairly early stage, also went on to making a whole set of arguments about why India should acquire nuclear weapons. Not necessarily in a very direct way, but in slightly oblique ways. So, for example, here at one of the Pugwash meetings in India in 1964, he said, a country like China must always present a threat to its neighbors. Right? Of course, he doesn't say who the neighbor is, but the implication is obvious. And so this is Bhabha sort of implicitly advocating for nuclear weapons being acquired by India. And he also went on to talk about how cheap nuclear weapons were, and used. And these are, by the way, these are not numbers that he made up. What he actually did was to mine the literature that was coming out of Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in the United States, where they were making similar arguments for the case of the United States, saying, making hydrogen bombs is really not that expensive. We should do lots of them, right? And so the same argument sort of translates over. The point, of course, which I'm trying to make is that when it comes to these kinds of activities, they're not really acting as technical experts. They're making arguments on political levels, right? And so the scientist as a technical expert and the scientist as a politician are not really that separated. All right, and just to sort of go on, there are various people in the Indian nuclear program who went on to sort of saying, well, we can't stop just with testing once, we have to now make hydrogen bombs, we have to do other things, right? And another head of the Atomic Energy Commission sort of talking about how to be able to put together an atomic device was the most exhilarating experience in my career. So there's a way by which many of these activities have been valorized for young scientists and young students to sort of be attracted to. All right, enough of that sort of very dreary stuff. I also now want to come back to Karl Polanyi, who also talked about, interestingly, what the implications of the expansion of the market was. And what is interesting was he talks about not just what happens to workers and so on, but also the devastation of neighborhoods, the denudation of forests, the pollution of rivers, and so on and so forth, right? Very prescient in some ways. And I would argue that, and what Polanyi was sort of saying was that there was no way in the activity of the trading classes, which he saw as the prime motivator for the expansion of the market, to actually sense these things. They were removed from that. Right? The impacts were happening somewhere else to somebody else, and there was no organic way, there was no institutional way for these classes to actually feel that impact, to be able to take it into account. And in a way, in many of the places where these kind of activities are happening, whether it's Los Alamos or whether it's some of the laboratories where other activities are happening, there is no way for them to be able to feel the pain, feel the impact elsewhere, right? And they're sort of distanced from that. And this impact is what creates the counter movement in the case of Polanyi. And I would argue it's exactly the same kind of thing which happens in the world of science and the impacts of science elsewhere. And so an analog in science is that there is sort of an activity that is involved in trying to oppose the ongoing activity of destruction, right? And trying to ameliorate the possibility of crisis and catastrophe. that happens, just as it happens in the social world. And so this happened, again, Emma sort of talked about this in the beginning, right at the dawn of the atomic age, when a bunch of very prominent scientists, including Albert Einstein, Harold Urey, and Weishaupt, and Szilard, and so on, came together to form something called the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, which is sort of a few buildings down from my office, minus 221 Nassau Street. That's where I work right now. So they basically talked about how the release of atomic energy has brought to the world the most revolutionary force since prehistoric man's discovery of fire, and so on and so forth. And then Einstein made his famous statement about how there is no secret and there is no defense, and there is no possibility of control except through the aroused understanding and insistence of the peoples of the world. And I'll come back to this. And the other thing which they stressed very importantly was their inescapable responsibility to carry out to our fellow citizens an understanding of the simple facts of atomic energy and its implications for society, right? So this, and by this was 1947, and by this, in those 2 years, you could also see the change that the kind of movement that the scientists had been doing on the person who actually fathered the atomic bomb, Robert Oppenheimer, who went on that same year to MIT, and he talked about how in some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin. This is not terminology that physicists used to use, right? And the atomic age in that sense was profound. And as Oppenheimer said, this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. So this is something which I think we all have to deal with even today. And so there's been a huge amount of effort by scientists to try and argue against the ongoing buildup of nuclear weapons, about plans for its expansion, refinement, modernization, deployment in other countries, proliferation of nuclear weapons, and even to some extent the acquisition of nuclear power because of its connections, and I'll talk briefly about that later. When it comes to these kind of activities which are involved in trying to oppose or trying to slow down the atomic race, there are two paths that scientists have taken. The classic terminology for this is inside and outside, right? Inside are people who work within the formal system of decision-making, whether it's in the branches of the government, advisory bodies, and so on. And outside are those who are primarily addressing themselves to members of the public. As you can see from the earlier statement by the Emergency Committee, they were addressing themselves primarily to the public, right? Though many of those individual scientists did play roles in advisory committees and so on, Oppenheimer himself was a very great example of that. And interestingly, when he and Einstein coexisted in the Institute for Advanced Study for many years, Oppenheimer was the director, Einstein was the most well-known member of the institute. They had always this profound difference that Oppenheimer was always sort of whizzing off to Washington, meeting with generals and senators and so on, and he would, people who observed him during those years would talk about how he would sort of look forward with sort of excitement and trepidation, the possibility of meeting all these people. Einstein, on the other hand, couldn't care less for meeting any of these people, right? He was just sort of on his own, and he was addressing himself primarily to members of the public. This is a profound sort of difference. In the rest of the talk, given the sort of short amount of time, I'm going to say very briefly that the working on the inside does have its role, because there are many technical questions requiring technical input, which is not always decided by politics. That happens within the formal structures of decision making. But this is not something which happens very well in many, many countries. There are very few structures that allow for independent experts to offer input in many countries. The United States is a little bit of an exception, Canada to some extent too. But there are also very powerful constraints on who can actually go into the inside to start with. By and large, your ideology has to be aligned with the ideology of those in power. Otherwise, you're never going to be invited on the inside unless there's an extremely strong social movement that's propelling you inside. And I will talk about that a little later. The other thing which many people who have gone on the inside basically say is things don't work there, right? you find, the reason that many of them do end up on the inside is because they've been active on the outside, and then they find that there's an opening, they go in, and then they find that it takes just too long, right? You're sort of stuck in bureaucratic battles. And perhaps the best known comment that I can think of is this chemist, George Kistiakowsky, who was also at the Los Alamos on the Manhattan Project, and who was also the advisor to President Kennedy and so on, who said, forget the channels, there's simply not enough time left before the world explodes. Concentrate instead on organizing with so many others that are of like mind a mass movement for peace such as there had not been before. If you come to sort of the outside roles, the sociologist Kelly Moore has sort of classified them into three kinds of periods and three kinds of roles that they played. In the early 1950s, there were a number of scientists who were pacifists who renounced all kinds of research. Many of them who are in the sciences found it extremely hard because the Atomic Energy Commission in the United States was the main source of funding for a lot of nuclear research. And many of them renounced that kind of funding. Some had to leave the field, but they tried to go around convincing other people not to indulge in this kind of research. That is one kind of role. A second was in the late 1950s as concern about nuclear testing began to grow in the members of the public. This was the period when the United States and the Soviet Union were carrying out large numbers of above-ground tests, which were contaminating huge amounts of land with various radioactive fallouts, iodine, strontium, things of that sort. And there was this period when people went around collecting baby teeth, the teeth which would fall off young children, and measuring strontium concentrations in that, which got people really, really concerned. But to try and talk about strontium and iodine and radioactive dose and so on, you needed to know something about these things. And this was the kind of role which many scientists saw them that would be ideal for themselves. And so you had people like Linus Pauling play this role, Ralph Lapp, a number of people. And then in the 1960s, there was a different kind of movement, which was scientists who became not just informers of social movements or trying to foment social movements, but actually participate in them or have some kind of critical conversation with them where there's a back and forth. It was not just the provision of information to them, but actually letting your agenda be shaped by these social movements. And then also not saying that my activity should only stop at the limits of provision of information or only talk about technical things, but also deeply expose the political nature of what people were doing. And so this is something which, I'll sort of now jump to quickly, is something which happens today too, right? There are a huge number of movements, and here I think the climate is a particularly important one. So these are pictures from the climate march in Washington, as well as large anti-war movements that have happened in the last decade, especially before the invasion of Iraq, and so on and so forth. So the social movements that existed in the 1960s do exist. The problem is that social movements to oppose nuclear weapons at this point are, shall we say, fairly modest. If you go around giving talks in these peace movement circles, you can see there'll be 6 people sitting in the audience. This is a welcome change from that. And it is hard. If you're organizers, you know that it is actually very hard to build a movement when there is no grave threat out there. Right? This is the prime difference between climate and nuclear weapons. Right? Nuclear weapons, for the most part, literally and figuratively sit in a hole in the ground, right? In some silo somewhere. It's not something which intrudes into people's daily lives in any significant way. And so, as the old cliched saying goes, out of sight, out of mind, it's very hard to imagine today that there is going to be a huge anti-nuclear weapons rally in New York, such as what happened in 1982. And the big difference, of course, is that in 1982, there was this clear buildup of cruise missiles in Europe, Reagan had come to power, and he was sort of threatening to use nuclear weapons in all kinds of places. And so the circumstances are very different. But yet, one cannot sort of escape from trying to build social movements. And so the question that people who are involved in social movements really grapple with is, how does one mobilize? And the only answer that I have seen that makes any kind of sense is you have to build connections, right? Is there a connection between the movement against climate and the movement against nuclear weapons, or the movement that we would like to have about nuclear weapons? And I guess the one easy sort of connection that one can make is the question about nuclear energy, right? And it's something which, unfortunately, if you're interested in nuclear disarmament, it's not a question you can duck. What is the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons? And I should skip that thing. The connection, I think, and the reason why you cannot really duck this question is because there is a very deep connection. There are two kinds of connections. One is that the technology that's involved in generating energy from the atom is by and large the same technology that is used to make highly enriched uranium and plutonium that are used in nuclear weapons. So there's a material connection, right? There's also the fact that when you try to generate nuclear power, you have to train necessarily a large number of people in the physics, in the chemistry, in the metallurgy, in the high-speed electronics that you sort of need to require to control a nuclear reactor. Much of it, not all, much of it also does translate into trying to build nuclear weapons. Right? The second larger connection is that institutionally, the institutions that that produce nuclear power often also seem to be the institutions that are involved in nuclear weapons research at some level. This is dangerous territory for me saying this in Canada, but it's certainly true in the United States. It's true in India, which I sort of studied best. And in the Indian case, it's particularly interesting because the institution that generated nuclear power first is also the institution that made nuclear weapons, the Department of Atomic Energy. And the Department of Atomic Energy is an extremely powerful, politically powerful organization. And the reason it is uniquely and strongly powerful is because it can promise something which no other institution can promise, which is to put it crudely, it promises the means of mass production, mass consumption, and mass destruction, right? So on the one hand, it says, I can generate cheap electrical energy, right? And you need lots of it because you have 1 billion people, you're always growing, and look at the United States, look at Canada, wherever you want, and we need to generate large amounts of electricity, and we are the ones who can do it. Coal will run out, we don't have enough rivers. And at the same time, if you point out that, look, you have not done a great job so far, nuclear energy is about 2% of the country's electricity, it's expensive, it's unsafe, whatever is your argument, then they quickly switch forward and say, well, but we can also promise you perfect security, right? Because we have the nuclear weapon, so nobody can ever attack us. So they're in this unique position where they can gain political power by trading off one against the other. It's the sort of the cliched sort of Janus-faced technology. And so this is one reason why you cannot really duck this question. This is actually particularly problematic when it comes to the question of climate change, and we can talk about that later, but I'm probably running out of time at this point, so I won't get into that. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that on the question of social movements, in the nuclear field, the only social movement that is out there is opposition to nuclear power in many, many different countries. In India, certainly that is the case. And the history of the anti-nuclear weapons movement in India that grew after the 1998 nuclear tests is interesting because the largest umbrella organization that was formed was something called the Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace. It was a group of over 600 grassroots groups came together in Delhi in the year 2000 to form this umbrella organization. And these are not groups that worked on peace. They were people who had worked on education or women's health or any environmental issues. And they all came together to say, look, we see that the development of nuclear weapons is not good for any of our agendas, right? So it was a very broad-based group. And initially, they had a very hard time trying to decide on what to say about nuclear power, right? And so they actually agreed to split the difference and say, we will not say anything about nuclear power. You could be anti-nuclear power or you could be for it. And you can both belong to it. But over the last 10 years, 15 years now, they have found themselves more and more often taking positions which are very critical of nuclear power. As an organization, they still cannot come out and say, we are against nuclear power or not. But on very many individual issues, they have had to come out and say, we don't support the government for doing this and that. And this is primarily because the active movements in the country are movements around proposed nuclear power plants, proposed uranium mines. And these movements come and challenge the Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace. Look, you're for peace, you're for disarmament. How can you sort of support this activity here? Right? You can see the connections just as well as we can see it. And so you find many of these people sort of coming, these groups coming out and saying, okay, well, we are opposed to nuclear power, even though we can see that, the country needs electricity, the country needs all kinds of things, but we don't quite see nuclear power as the way to go about it. Anyway, all right, I will sort of conclude just in a couple of statements about why is it that scientists, science students, and so on need to even sort of play a part in this debate. The first is, let me actually go back to a shorter quote. I sort of switched my order of slides when I was doing my changing. The first is that I think many of these choices are being made by extremely exclusive small circles, people in power. And they do the choosing, the other people do the risking, right? And to the extent that the people who are, and what's also true is that the people who make these choices are very good at passing off what choices they're making as being beneficial to everybody, right? It takes somebody who understands what the issues are, the technical issues are, to be able to go out and explain things to people, right? And so it is in this role that I think Noam Chomsky, one of the great intellectuals of our age, said this very wisely. He said, intellectuals are in a unique position to expose the lies of the governments, to analyze actions according to causes and motives. And, and he goes on, where he says why the role of intellectuals and scientists in some sense are intellectuals because they do perform intellectual labor. Their role is very, very important. And the second, I think, is that when there are these social movements which are contesting questions which have to do with science and technology, the role of people who have this kind of knowledge is extremely critical, right? Because many of these decisions, whether it is about genetically modified organisms, is about pesticides, a whole range of things, some people might have to know what the difference between a DNA and RNA is, or between strontium and iodine is. These are important questions that come up. And so to the extent that you have people who are trained in science or in other important aspects of intellectual inquiry, do place themselves at the services of social movements, I think those social movements benefit. Is there a reason why scientists should be doing this? I think in today's world, I think this is particularly important. Because unlike maybe, let's say, the 1950s, when scientists started playing these public roles, in today's world, the autonomy of scientists and people working in universities is increasingly being encroached upon, right? John talked about how science likes dissent, or at least encourages dissent. But the question is whether this dissent is confined to questions of science, or is it dissent at large, right? And I want to sort of recount the case of Stephen Salaita. Any of you have heard of him? So he is an English professor. He had been given a job at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And after getting his job offer, the trustees of the university decided to take away his job offer, right? They withdraw his job offer. And the reason was Salaita had, during the recent conflict over Gaza, had tweeted some comments which apparently the trustees saw as being critical of Israel, right? So there's so much for academic freedom in today's world. Much more and more of academia is being controlled by the kind of resources that you can generate, the administrative people who sort of see the trustees, the role of private capital and so on, is just increasing so much that the space that intellectuals and scientists have to be able to take positions on questions of public importance is shrinking, right? And to the extent that you have any kind of source of support in that sense, I think social movements actually do play a very important part. And the other thing which I sort of would like to say is that, what is also increasingly obvious in today's world is that we don't live in a very homogeneous society. The Occupy movement's great slogan about the 1% and the 99%, which team you sort of support makes a huge difference to these kind of movements. It is sort of, the problem with, of course, doing that is that it puts you in the periphery of many of these debates. You are never going to be invited to the White House or any of these places to offer your expertise if you happen to sort of go out and protest in Zuccotti Plaza in New York. But nevertheless, I think that's sort of an important thing. And I'll end up with this quote from this modern classic, Harry Potter, where it says, "It's our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are far more than our abilities." Thank you.